Don't fear my size, a midnight bond on Colorado-7 and the plot to steal a star silver mine. Life out here will slam you so hard your lungs forget the choreography, and then, like nothing happened, it will hand you a miracle wrapped inside a knock at your door. On Colorado-7, winter doesn't arrive, it assembles. Ion winds stack violet fire along the storm ribs, turbines bow their steel necks, and every module under every glass dome remembers what it owes the cold. Edy Brooks had already paid more than her share. 3 winters stole 3 things in order: husband, health, and the kind of strength you only notice when it's gone. She lived alone at Widow's Peak Outpost with 40 hectares of terraclaim her late man had staked 6 years back, a plasma carbine over the door, and a ledger that balanced because she refused to quit. Then came the knock. Soft at first, almost shy, like the universe wasn't sure it had the right address. When Edy cracked the airlock, a giant boy slumped against her threshold, half-frozen and polite. "Please, ma'am," he said, fogging the night with his breath, "I just need bread." If you've been on the rim long enough, you know this: sometimes the storm isn't the danger. Sometimes it's the story that stumbles in from it. The boy's name was Harlan Tait, 18 by colony count, 2 meters of gentle caution and raw muscle grown in low-gravity shifts, and he was about to drag a town's hypocrisy into the light. Because under Edy's soil lay argent, 9, star silver, the quantum vein syndicates would sell their saints for. 3 respectable men in town knew it. They planned to take the land with paperwork, call it morality, and sleep warm. This is the tale of a midnight bond contract under a glass dome, a gossip who chose redemption, a marshal who remembered the law is for the living, and a giant who learned that power is best measured by how softly it sets a thing down. It's HFY to the bone, humans winning because we make the stubborn choice to belong to each other. Before we roll the tape, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And if the rim's kind of courage speaks to you, subscribe, there's another campfire story warming up for tomorrow. Chapter 1, The Storm That Knocked and Asked for Bread. Out beyond the last ridge, the sky knuckled the dome, testing seams. Widow's Peak Outpost hummed like a woman counting under her breath to keep steady: heat loop green, oxygen blue, hull integrity in the safe band if nothing got clever. Edy Brooks stitched a tear in a thermal shirt by the orange mouth of the geothermal stove, needle flashing like a small honest star. Above the door, a short plasma carbine rested where Samuel had hung it the week he finished the roof. The knock came again, not the swagger of a bandit, not the impatient rattle of a neighbor. A tired request. Edy went to the inner seal and brought up the external cam. Snow ghosted past in shredded veils. The figure on her stoop looked like a collapsed shed wearing a boy's face. Big, too big for comfort, shoulders packed with work, hands like spades. Frost crusted his hair. When he looked up into the lens, his eyes were the shy brown of someone raised to mind his size and his voice. She lowered the pressure, cracked the door, and kept the carbine where it could talk if it had to. "Who are you?" "Harlan Tait," he said, chattering carefully so the words didn't break. "Trinidad Station. Fever took my folks. Been walking. I just need bread." There are moments the rim makes you choose between being smart and being good, and the trick is to do both in one move. Edy yanked the inner latch, dragged 2 meters of freezing boy through with a grunt that would have made Samuel proud, and slammed the lock. Heat kissed his face. His lips tried for blue and mist, they were too numb. "Sit," she said, shoving a chair toward the stove. His knees obeyed gravity like grateful children. She poured coffee, then changed her mind and made it half milk, half boil, dusted it with salt the way her mother had for shock. His hands couldn't hold the mug, she wrapped his fingers around it and held them there. "Drink slow," she ordered. "Your stomach's emptier than a Monday church." He obeyed like it was a rule worth living by. When his eyes met hers over the rim, gratitude wasn't a performance, just a fact. She ladled stew thick with hydroponic greens and yesterday's roast, set a hunk of bread next to it, and pretended not to watch him fight the urge to shovel. Polite hunger is the frontier's favorite heartbreak. "Where you headed?" she asked when the bowl shone clean. No place particular, he said, voice roughened into honesty. Just away from Trinidad. Too many memories there. Barn's warmer than out there, Edy said. You can sleep next to the auxiliary exchangers. Any funny business and you'll lose whatever you brought through that door. Yes, ma'am. No offense taken, if anything, he looked relieved to have rules. I'll work for my keep. I'm good with my hands. Tomorrow's problems are tomorrow's, she said, already calculating the gasket she couldn't reach last week and the turbine that had been singing off-key. She watched the boy, no, the very young man, stand with care, the way big things do when they mean no harm. In the stove's glow, for a slip of a second, she saw Samuel at 20, quiet pride, cautious grace, and the memory hit like a door she hadn't opened in years. Name's Edy, she said, because it felt wrong to stay a stranger in her own kitchen. You'll call me that when we're working, and ma'am when you're about to do something dumb. A corner of his mouth tried a smile and succeeded. Yes, ma'am. That night, the storm wrote its violet signature along the dome ribs. In the machine bay, Harlan slept in his coat with his boots under his head and one hand open, palm up, the posture of someone who'd learned not to wake with fists. Edy lay awake a long time listening to the wind chew the world and realized the sound inside her chest wasn't fear. It was a thing she hadn't heard since Samuel died. It was company. Chapter 2, One night, then 2, then a month. On the rim, usefulness is a love language. Harlan spoke it from sunup. By first light he'd scraped ice from the intake vents and reseated the seal on the main heat loop with an improvised clamp that would have made the parts catalog blush. He checked the turbine ring and found the blade that had been throwing the song off, hairline warp, easy fix if you had size and restraint in the same pair of arms. He did. He ran the irrigation in greenhouse too, coaxing stunted lettuces to perk like stubborn kids at recess. When a calf from the nanobison line arrived shivering and mad at gravity, he cradled it like a sacrament. The animal breathed into his chest and forgave the planet. Edy watched the way he moved through work, large but drafted fine. Big men can be loud without making a sound. Harlan was quiet by architecture. He asked where to set things. He cleaned what he dirted. He sang under his breath once, something from Trinidad Station perhaps, and hushed himself when he remembered other people could hear. In the evenings they settled into a rhythm old as survival. Edy mended pressure cuffs and patched the sleeves Samuel had torn the last autumn he was alive, as if her thread could tie time. Harlan carved, first with a little hand blade, then with the low-power laser she grudgingly let him use after he proved he wasn't in love with bleeding. Tiny creatures emerged from scrap polymer, a pronghorn with its legs tucked under, an eagle too earnest to be fierce, a square-headed horse with Samuel's habit of pretending not to be proud. Samuel would have liked you, she said one April cold night, surprising them both. Harlan's hands stilled. You loved him a lot, he said, not prying, not pitying. 15 years, she said. He put his hand on these rocks and told me he could feel them promising. She gestured around, the stove, the tidy shelves, the glass. He built what he promised. He's still here, Harlan said, nodding at the hinge that never squeaked because someone wouldn't let it, at the way the table had been sanded smooth where hands always landed. In the things that do their jobs. In you. The sentence found the softest place in her and sat down. Valleynet, being what it is anywhere humans gather, noticed the extra pair of hands at Widow's Peak and did the arithmetic it prefers. Delia Moon, self-appointed broadcaster of other people's weather, posted a string of updates that sounded helpful if you weren't listening. Boy seen hauling cordwood shirtless, scandal, widow observed smiling at porch, improper, dinner hour later than usual, domestic. Edy ignored it because a woman alone on the rim learns to treat gossip like static unless it announces fire. Still, she set rules out loud because naming things helps. You sleep in the machine bay, she told Harlan. You log your hours for wages and meals. If you have a question about propriety, ask me before someone decides for us. Yes, ma'am, he said, and that was that, except it wasn't, not inside the place where rules do not always reach. Spring on Colorado-7 doesn't so much arrive as give the snow permission to leave in strips. One evening, with the world between storms and the air holding still like a child at show and tell, Edy said what sensible women say when they see the cliff coming. Come June, you should go to Denver Hub. A young man like you could make something of himself down there. Harlan set his carving knife down with the care you use for things that can cut two ways. Is that what you want? It's what's proper. He looked straight at her, gentle as ever and impossibly sure. Proper for who? She did not have a clean answer. She had a needle, a shirt, and a heart that had changed the way it counted days without asking permission. That night, the wind slept. So did the story, for a few hours. Chapter 3, The Line Between Proper and Right. There is a quiet the rim saves for choices. It filled the room the night Harlan stood and finally let his height be what it was. I want to stay, he said. Not the boy on the stoop anymore. Not a hand for hire. Not as your worker. Not as the half-frozen kid you rescued. I want to stay as your man. Edy's breath went shallow, then careful. The words were a weighty tool. Held wrong, they could crack bone. She pushed up from her chair too fast, the mending basket clattering its little brass tokens of domestic order across the floor. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly, he said, steady as if the deck weren't pitching. I know I have nowhere I'd rather lay my head than here. I know your company feels like work I'm good at. He took one slow step, then another, leaving space in front of him so the room could think. When he lifted his hand and touched her cheek, it was the way you put palm to glass to test a seal, respectful, certain. Don't be afraid of my size, he said softly. I'll always be gentle with you. They were a breath from rewriting both their maps when the knock came here and now and very loud. Headlamps burned the yard into interrogation. Drones hovered like suspicious stars. The outer door boomed once, then opened without being invited. Reverend Morrison, moral custodian by appointment and habit, stepped in with Mayor Fitzpatrick's calculating grin and Doc Henderson's medical frown. Two deputies of no particular opinion flanked them, which is a kind of opinion. Edy Brooks, Morrison said, already certain of the script. We need to speak about your living situation. You need to get out of my house, Edy said, carbine still on its hooks because she was not foolish and the law was watching. Her voice did not tremble. Fear was busy doing other jobs in her. Morrison's gaze slid past her to measure Harlan the way a butcher measures a steer, as if size proved everything. Son, you'll pack your things and leave. Tonight. This is my home, Harlan said, stepping behind Edy without hiding behind her. I'm not leaving. Fitzpatrick's smile showed tobacco and confidence. Boy, you're 18 and she's old enough to have taught your mother her letters. It's unseemly at best. We haven't done anything wrong, Edy said, because it was true and also because truth is stubborn whether it helps or not. Doc Henderson produced a leather folio as if unveiling a saint. Delia Moon has kept a careful record. April 15th, young male entering main cabin at sunrise, remaining after dark. 18th, shirtless labor observed while the widow watched. 22nd, intimate conversation on the porch. Intimate? Harlan said, color high. The weather was doing tricks. We talked about snow. Were you discussing precipitation when she touched your face last Tuesday? Fitzpatrick smirked, pleased to be disgusting in a way he could still call righteous. It's nobody's business, Edy said, and heard how thin that sounded in a room full of men who had come for precisely the business of making her business theirs. On the contrary. Morrison's voice lifted as if addressing an invisible congregation. The moral fabric of this valley is everyone's business. And a woman who would, he let the sentence suggest what he didn't dare say, with a boy is clearly unfit to manage her property. Doc Henderson has petitioned for an emergency mental health evaluation. He held up the paper like a sword blessed by bureaucracy. We'll take you in the morning. The cold that went through Edy then wasn't fear for herself, it was the understanding of theft looked straight in the eye. The asylum was a machine that turned women into quiet. Samuel had once joked that if there were a hell on Colorado-7, it would call itself a hospital to get better funding. Harlan stepped forward, hands open, sighs honest. You touch her and you'll what? Morrison snapped, delighted. Strike 3 respected citizens. That'll look fine on the docket. Edy caught Harlan's wrist, not to stop him from defending her, he didn't need stopping, he needed strategy. Please, she said, hating the word even as it did its work. Give us time to compound your sin. Morrison shook his head, a poor performance of sorrow. No. This ends at dawn. At the threshold, Fitzpatrick paused and let greed lift its mask. 40 hectares is a lot for a woman alone. Might be wise to sell before the winter finishes what it started. They left to the mutter of drones and the self-congratulation of men who think paperwork is morality. Neither they nor Edy saw the figure crouched behind the woodpile, breath held, eyes wide. Delia Moon had come to spy out of habit and stayed to hear the part she had missed, the plan spoken plain as theft. On the walk back to their mounts, voices carried. Think she'll sell? Henderson asked. She'll have to, Fitzpatrick said. Once we have her committed. And the land goes to auction, Morrison added, pious even in conspiracy. We'll be waiting. Surveyor confirmed it, Fitzpatrick said, too pleased to be cautious. Biggest Argent, 9 vein in 3 counties runs under her property. Delia's stomach dropped as if the dome had failed. She had spent weeks making radio static into scandal and missed the real weather entirely. She had never considered herself a hero, she collected secrets like other women collected quilts. But quilts can be warm, and secrets can be used to turn a fire the right way. She went to the door like a penitent and knocked the gentlest she knew how. Harlan turned, shoulders widening by reflex. Haven't you done enough? I came to warn you, Delia blurted, stepping into the lamplight like a sinner into rain. And to tell the truth about why those men were really here. She spilled it in a rush, the mine, the plan, the auction, the way 3 men meant to turn a woman's grief into cash. When she finished, no one spoke. Edy sat hard in Samuel's old rocker and stared at the floor as if the vein ran there. We can run, Harlan said at last, already inventorying what would fit on a skimmer. Run where? Edy asked, voice threaded steel. This is my home. Delia cleared her throat. There's a way, she said, and for the first time in her life the word felt like a gift instead of gossip. If you were married. Tonight. Silence took the room again, but it was a different quiet, full of math that might add up. Emergency commitment requires consent of next of kin or spouse, Delia said, quoting law and order threads she'd read for fun. And the immorality with a minor, twisting only works if he isn't your legal equal. Bond contracts are recognized under the charter same as marriage if a licensed celebrant witnesses. Pete Jenkins up on Coyote Ridge still holds papers. Harlan looked at Edy. The easy answer, the self-erasing answer, would have been for protection. She stood and stepped into her own weather. I won't marry you to save dirt, she said, and watched his face fall and then square to accept it. I'll marry you because I love you. Because somewhere between that knock and this breath you became the best thing left in my life. The land is a promise. You're the person I want to keep it with. The smile that broke across Harlan Tait could have lit a dome. Then let's go write it down, he said. They saddled the skimmer as the storm bent its head to listen. Delia took point, spotted mare nosing through powder. The ridge threw their headlights back like shy comets. Overhead, the ion layer flickered purple, painting the snow in false dawns. Behind them, Widow's Peak breathed steady, the little home that had learned to hold. Coyote Ridge waited with an old man and a book, and men with torches were already on their way. Chapter 4, The Ridge Between Fear and Choice. They ran the skimmer along the lee of the ridge where wind broke its teeth on rock. Snow feathered sideways, turning the world into strips of gray and pearl. Delia rode point on her spotted mare with a patience that made the animal brave. Behind, Harlan drove the skimmer like he was carrying glass, fast, but respectful of the planet's talent for taking offense. Edy sat beside him, gloved fingers curled around the dash rail, eyes on the light that spilled from the mare's chest lamp and made a moving tunnel in the winter. Halfway up, the ion layer flickered, thin purple lace on a black dress, and the skimmer's HUD blinked a warning about static load. Harlan lifted the craft another meter, easing off the throttle the way you quiet a child. "She'll hum, but she'll hold," he said. "You talk to machines," Edy said, smile quick and private inside the helmet. "I talk to anything that listens," he said. "You'd be surprised what answers." Delia's voice came back over the local channel, an apology hiding in a brisk report. Two of Morrison's drones pinged the lower trail, but were off their path. "Coyote Ridge stays blind in a storm. Old Pete says that's why the Saints like him." "Saints?" Edy said. "Lost cowboys and guilty priests," Delia replied, and for the first time since she'd knocked on their door her laugh sounded like a laugh and not a cough. They topped a shoulder where wind had shaved the snow down to old ice. Edy looked out and saw the valley the way the storm saw it, the glass domes like pearls strung along a logic only necessity understands, the turbine ring bent to the weather's grammar, the dark square of Widow's Peak, her home, small as a held breath. Fear tried a handhold. Love uncurled its fingers and took a better one. "I thought Proper would protect me," she said softly, surprised to be speaking so near the part of herself that preferred silence. "I thought if I kept my head down and did what the rulebooks asked, grief would let me alone. Turns out you have to choose a person, not just a posture." Harlan didn't look away from the way ahead. "I'm here for you to choose," he said simply. "I won't make you smaller to make the choosing easier." Delia slowed, letting the mare pick her feet across a wind-sculpted lip of rock. "For what it's worth," she said, Proper never protected anyone from men who learned to rename greed. They slid into a pocket of lee wind where the snow fell vertical and honest. A cabin hunched there like a stubborn idea someone had never gotten around to giving up. Light burned behind a sheet of plastic over a window. A chimney made of 3 different designs of pipe coughed a fat rope of smoke into the night. A hand-painted sign with the paint peeled to humility read, "Coyote Ridge Node, Chaplain and Notary, Rations, Once." Delia swung down and pounded on the door with a flat palm. "Pete. Open up your righteous bones." The door opened the width of a suspicion and then wider. Pete Jenkins looked like a man who had fought both civilization and wilderness to a draw and celebrated with bad whiskey. Beard to his belt, hair like a weather map, eyes absolutely sober the second they recognized the kind of trouble that puts its shoes on and stands straight. "Moon," he rasped, not unkindly. "I wondered when that debt would come claiming me." He looked Harlan up and down without flinching and then Edy and did something most men had forgotten to learn. He took in their posture to each other and not just their ages and their faces. "All right," he said, already turning into the cabin. "Bring them in. Get the storm off them. I've got 5 minutes of warmth and a license that scares more devils than you'd think." Inside, the room was one, stove, table, bed piled with quilts, a desk with a data slate so old its casing was proud of not dying. An old hound lifted his head, judged nobody a thief, and put it back down with a grunt. Pete shrugged into a shirt that had seen Sunday somewhere back on Earth and tugged it straight with a self-consciousness that looked like decency. "You sure?" he asked Edy, voice free of condescension. "Once I say it, we're all accountable to it. Marriage is a bell you hear the rest of your days." Edy didn't chase words. "I'm sure." Pete nodded like a foreman who just heard the plan that would get the crew home. He pulled a crackled leather folio from under the bed and set it on the desk. Inside lay an old paper certificate stamped with the charter's crest, a small black notary baton with a blue verification light that came awake under his thumb, and a key chip the color of old pennies. "This one's offline," he said, patting the baton. When the sky quits showing off, I'll push the record into ValleyNet. Until then, we notarize to paper, chip the bond to this key, and the law can come kiss the seal. Delia hovered near the stove as if she were afraid forgiveness might melt. I'll witness, she said. I swear it in my mother's name and on every lie I ever told that I'm done being used for other men's alibis. Good, Pete said. We'll need 2 signatures anyway, if the charter clerks want a thing to argue about tomorrow. He rummaged in a drawer, came up with 2 titanium washers, black with age. Rings, he said, and then, because men like Pete cannot resist honest crafts in an emergency, he took a strip of emery and polished until the metal remembered it was beautiful. You'll want something to touch when the wind gets uppity. Harlan stood very straight. The bigness of him had never looked less like threat. Pete, he said, could I want to say something. You'd better, Pete said. Else it's just a tax event with better cake. Harlan turned to Edy, the storm still leaking light under the door. I know I'm big, he said, and his voice did not apologize for it, it promised. I will never use my size to win an argument or hurry your heart. I will carry what's heavy. I will set it down soft. When fear climbs up your ladder and asks to be fed, I will feed it work and send it outside. I will listen like the weather is something we manage, not something we are. If I go first into the storm, it's not because I think you're weak. It's because I like the way you look in the door when I come back. Edy laughed and cried the small, efficient kind of tears that don't need an audience. I bring a house that runs, she said. A ledger that balances. A school in my head. I bring a mouth that will say what's wrong in time to fix it and hands that will fix it. I will not let you hide feeling behind the word practical. I will not let myself hide feeling behind the word proper. I will make lists with you when the world tilts and sit quiet with you when it doesn't. We will tell the truth even when it embarrasses us. Especially then. Pete looked down to keep from showing his face. The hound thumped his tail once, a dog's amen. Then let's put a stamp on it, Pete said, and reached for the book. Outside, a distant motor growled where a trail turned into a plan. Delia glanced at the window and saw orange beads of moving light threading the lower switchbacks, 6 riders pacing the grade like men late to an outrage. They're coming, she said. They can come, Pete answered. The words run faster. He set the baton on the paper and the blue light glowed steady. Hands, he said, and placed Edy's in Harlan's. Speak when it matters and shut up when it's just pride. Repeat after me. Chapter 5, The Midnight Bond. Lantern light made the cabin a church big enough for 4 and a dog. Pete read from Nothing and Everything, voice low and certain, picking vows like tools off a rack, what would hold under load, what wouldn't slip when wet. Do you, Harlan Tait, take Edy Brooks to be your partner in this weather and the next? To put your body between her and foolishness, hers, yours, or the town's, without making a cage out of it? To carry the heavy thing and set it down gentle? To keep the grid up and the lights honest and your temper on a leash? I do, Harlan said, like a man who had tried on a coat and found it was made for him. Do you, Edy Brooks, take Harlan Tait to be your partner in this weather and the next? To say the thing that needs saying when silence is the liar's friend? To share the ledger and the door key and the storm plan? To teach him how to rest and learn from his leaning? To call the law when it forgets the living? I do, Edy said, like a woman who had been holding her breath and decided the air could be trusted. Rings, Pete said, and they slid the polished washers over knuckles that had learned work. Titanium remembered being ore and promised to stay what it was. Pete lifted the baton and pressed it to the paper. It chimed a small, immodest sound. He handed Harlan the key chip. Keep that on you, he said. If a committee man tries to tell you you're not married, make him hold this while you explain how law works. He took up an old stamp pad, ink that smelled like remembered offices, and drove the seal home, Coyote Ridge Node, Charter Chaplain and Notary, witnessed and recorded. By the power vested in me by the Colorado-7 Charter and by the fact that the four of us in this room will swear it louder than any lie, Pete said, I pronounce you bonded partners, husband and wife, co-governors of whatever you build together. Son, you may kiss your bride. Harlan cupped Edy's face the way he had in the kitchen and whispered, because some words prefer to wear the same clothes every time, don't be afraid of my size. I'll always be gentle with you. Their first kiss as partners was brief and clean and made Delia look studiously at the ceiling with a smile she could not stop. The dog snored through it like an old man being kind. Then Pete's head snapped toward the window. Torches had climbed 2 switchbacks in the last minute. The growl of engines bullied the night. Time, he said, moving like a much younger man. He slid the certificate into a plastic sleeve and sealed it with heat from the stove side plate. He pressed the key chip into Harlan's palm hard enough to leave a print. Back to Widow's Peak, he ordered. Stand in your own doorway when the law pretends to have questions. Delia tightened the mare's cinch and checked the battery on the chest lamp. I'll ride ahead and wake Caldwell, she said. If he's the law tonight, let it be the kind that knows which way is up. I've already sent a packet to Judge Fleming with what I heard in Tom Bradley's survey. With any mercy, they'll meet us on the road. And if there isn't mercy? Edy asked. Then we bring receipts, Delia said, patting the satchel where copies rustled. And a town that just learned it likes itself better when it's decent. They plunged into the cold. The storm had eased to a hiss, but the night still wore its teeth. The 6 riders, Morrison, Fitzpatrick, Henderson, and 3 men with more muscle than judgment, had crested the second switchback. Their headlamps painted the snow with authority's favorite color, glare. Go, Pete hissed, swinging his own glassy old skimmer across the trail to make an extra 30 seconds of argument. I'll discuss the nature of God with the Reverend if he wants a sermon. They shot past, Delia laying down a line only a fool would follow in her wake. The ridge fell away beneath them, a sled ride drawn by necessity. Harlan kept the skimmer fixed and forgiving, one eye on the HUD, one on the land he had begun to think of not as a place to sleep but as a wife's first promise. Wind gnawed. Silence did the rest. Widow's Peak rose out of the night with its dome uncracked and its porch light burning because some habits are sacraments. Harlan cut the engine and let them slide the last 2 meters with the dignity of people who do not run into their own lives, they arrive. They stood on their threshold and listened to the engines clawing up the last of the grade. Edy slid the plastic sleeve under the paperweight Samuel had made, 2 nails welded in a cross and a washer he'd polished out of boredom. She set the notary key on the table like a weapon kinder than guns. Harlan checked the door latch, then left it open, because cowards bar doors and partners stand in them. Torches spilled into the yard. 6 men arranged themselves the way bullies always do when they hope you haven't learned geometry. Reverend Morrison lifted his chin to the sky like it would back him. Edy Brooks, he called, voice amplified by certainty, come out. We have legal documents to serve. Edy stepped forward with the clean, unhurried grace of a woman who has put her name on a new line and likes how it looks. Harlan matched her, big and quiet, the gravity of a planet choosing who gets to land. Gentlemen, she said, and held up a piece of paper that changed the math. Meet my husband. The torches wavered. Somewhere out on the road, a separate engine rose, the marshal's truck, or Mercy, or both. The wind turned its head, interested in how humans would conduct themselves in its yard. The night took a breath it had been holding since the knock on the door. Chapter 6, Dawn on the Porch, Law in the Yard. The engine stopped like a fist unclenching. Frost crackled under boots. Reverend Morrison stepped forward with a rhetoric smile and a folder that believed in itself. Fitzpatrick loomed beside him, calculating angles. Henderson clutched a medical bag as if it were a warrant. Edy Brooks, Morrison intoned, by authority of. Edy Tait, she corrected, and put the paper where every eye could see the seal, Coyote Ridge Node, witnessed and recorded. Harlan set the notary key on the porch rail, the verification light pulsed, alive, unmistakable. Fitzpatrick's cigar fell and hissed in snow. You can't just. Mary? Harlan said, not unkind. We did. Marshal Caldwell rolled up in a battered truck, gravel popping. He took the porch steps 2 at a time, palm up for the document. Edy handed it over. He read the bond contract like a man counting fence posts, steady, thorough, out loud enough to be a record. Chaplain Jenkins, he said finally, licensed per charter. 2 witnesses. He looked at Delia's signature and raised a brow. She met it without flinching. Key confirms. Henderson rallied, papers trembling. Emergency psychiatric evaluation, subject demonstrates compromised judgment, susceptible to predatory influence. Based on? Caldwell asked. A series of community observations, Henderson said, producing Delia's old notebook like a sacrament. Delia cleared her throat. Those pages were weaponized without my consent, she said, voice ringing just enough. I hereby recant any implication of impropriety and submit sworn testimony that these men discussed stealing her land for the Argent 9 vein they concealed from the town. Fitzpatrick barked a laugh that aimed for amused and landed uncornered. Gossip. Lights washed the yard. A second vehicle slid in, sleek, official, wrong for these roads. Judge Marcus Fleming unfolded from the passenger side in traveling robes, cold air snapping them straight. Tom Bradley climbed down behind him with a drone case and a topographic printout that smelled like oil and proof. Proceed, Fleming said to Caldwell, and the marshal did, short, neat, nothing wasted. The judge took the bond, the key, the notebook, the survey maps. Tom flicked the drone feed onto a handheld, under Edy's claim, bright veins of Argent 9 braided like a river under rock, under Fitzpatrick's holdings, only the gloom of ordinary stone. Fleming turned to the 3 respectables. Conspiracy to defraud a terra claimer, he said, voice as clean as ice. Abuse of medical process. Attempted coercion under color of moral authority. He lifted a hand toward Caldwell without shifting his gaze. Arrest them. Henderson dropped his folder in slush. Morrison made a throat noise like a hymn gone wrong. Fitzpatrick, desperate, jabbed a finger at Harlan. He's a boy. This is a sham. I turned 18 in January, Harlan said. My size wasn't forged yesterday. He stepped off the porch, closed the distance in 3 easy strides, and lifted Fitzpatrick an inch by the front of his coat. The gesture wasn't violent, it was instructional. That woman is my wife, he said softly, like a weather report. We are done being your project. He set the mayor down with the care he uses for fragile equipment and stepped back to let the law do its better work. Caldwell cuffed the 3 with the grim efficiency of a man who hates paperwork but loves order. Delia exhaled like a valve finally seating. Judge Fleming faced Edy and Harlan. In the morning light their rings looked like honest machinery. Mrs. Tait, he said, your bond is valid. Your property rights are secure. Mr. Tait, as co-signatory you are recognized as co-governor of this holding under the charter. Regarding the vein, consult counsel before you sign a single paper with anyone who smiles too easily. Edy nodded, something old and hard in her shoulders unclenching at last. We'll build it right, she said. Or we won't build it. See that you do, Fleming replied, and the corner of his mouth admitted he hoped they would. The engines took the conspirators downhill. The ridge exhaled. Harlan leaned his shoulder to Edy's, a wall that was also a door. Behind them, the kitchen smelled like coffee and the future. Home, he said. Home, she agreed, and the dome hummed its consent. Chapter 7, The Town That Learned Its Ledger. By noon the story had outpaced the trucks. People came, riders with wind-burned cheeks, greenhouse techs blinking into the pale sun, kids with questions they didn't know how to hide. They brought pastry and opinions and a listening that felt like respect. Edy dragged the library chalkboard onto the porch and drew 3 columns with a steadiness that comforted people who liked lists. What happened? What we do next. What we learn. Under the first, she wrote, tried to steal land with paperwork. Stopped by law plus witnesses plus key. Under the second, monthly open ledger. School module. Safety co-op, mining plan with guardrails. Under the third, gossip can be redirected. Rules are tools, not weapons. Proper, without, good, is just a costume. She looked up. We publish our books, she said. All of them. Money. Storm prep. Who does what when we hear the wrong kind of knock? Caldwell, still at the edge of the crowd, half smiled. You're going to make my job harder. I'm going to make your job easier, Edy said. Harder on the lazy parts. Delia stepped forward like a penitent and a candidate. I'd like to keep the books, she said. And the minutes. I'm good at collecting things. I'd like to collect the right ones. Done, Edy said, and held out a hand. Delia took it in both of hers, as if hands were contracts that mattered more than seals. By week's end, the school module was framed, windows tilted to drink winter light, a row of hooks stenciled with names in paint that refused to smudge. Curriculum pinned itself to string with clothespins, math for grids. Ledger 13 went on a wall display in the library. Numbers flowed in honest columns. Argent 9 occupied its own page, with expense lines for ventilation, supports, safety gear, and a thick ringed line item labeled community fund that grew every month because they chose it to. Once a month the town gathered in the library, now the warmest room in the valley, to read the numbers aloud and ask good questions. Edy kept a pot on. Harlan made a habit of carving as people spoke. It calmed the room to watch a block of scrap become a bird with believable wings. There were stumbles. That is how communities proofread themselves. A contractor from the Corps tried to sneak a clause into a draft that would have bound there or at a discount forever. Delia caught it and stapled the page to the bulletin board under what we learn. A teenager rolled their eyes at storm duty. Edy handed them the chalk and a marker, and by the end of the week they could recite the Ventseal sequence better than anyone. Caldwell established an anonymous line to report abuse of process. It stayed mostly quiet, which meant the noise was happening where noise can help. And there were little luxuries that felt like principles. The library got a second shelf of paper books because paper asks you to sit down. The school had a bell they rang for joy as often as for class. Pearl, who had marched up from town the day of the wedding with a bag and an opinion, ran the kitchen with a system that met the strictest tests known to civilization. Is it hot? Is it on time? Does it taste like being included? On a clear evening, the charter committee arrived not with torches but with notebooks. Director Anwar toured the school and the powerhouse, touched the ledger display, watched a drill on the storm plan that ran like choreography. You understand, she said finally, we came to see if you were compliant. We are leaving with a template. Take the recipe, Edy said. But don't forget the ingredient you can't log. Anwar tilted her head. Which is? Each other, Edy said simply. We chose to be in the room. The director nodded like someone who would not write that part down but would remember it anyway. That night, after the meeting and the stew and the blessed noise of children allowed to be tired, Harlan and Edy stood under the glass, listening to the turbines translate wind. He held up a small, bright thing he'd carved without her noticing, a washer on a cord, polished to a soft shine. For the school bell rope, he said. So the knot has a promise on it. Edy slipped it into place and tugged. The bell answered clear as a vow. Chapter 8, The Inheritance of Warmth. 5 years did what 5 years do, smoothed some edges, revealed others. The Tait Argent mine learned to breathe, ventilation humming, supports honest, safety drills turned into muscle memory. The vein paid, but not in a way that made them forget themselves. The community fund sent 2 kids a year to the Corps for training and brought them home again because the curriculum included return. The school's windows filled with paintings that knew what wind looks like in purple. Fitzpatrick, Morrison, and Henderson served 2 years. On release they found that exile is sometimes local, no one wanted their kind of leadership anymore. The valley had discovered a better style, louder laughter, quieter greed. Delia Moon kept ledger, 13 like a hymnal. When she wrote receipts she tucked a paper crane into the envelope because redemption ought to have a shape. Pearl terrorized the pantry into excellence and taught 3 teenagers how to dice onions without sacrificing dignity. Caldwell, older, slower, still dangerous to pettiness, married the greenhouse foreman in a ceremony under the dome where vows were read off an index card and the cake rose like a miracle in a world with consistent gravity. Judge Fleming attended in work boots. Director Anwar sent a note on official stationery that said simply, "Well done. Keep going." Harlan grew into his height the way trees do, up because down held. He ran crews, filed reports, and still chopped wood because ritual tells mornings where to begin. In the evenings he carved at the corner of the library table as kids did homework around him, answering questions with a grunt or a sentence or a raised brow depending on what the work required. He never raised his voice to make a point. He lifted something heavy and set it down gentle instead. People understood. Edy became the address the town sent its questions to. She walked the line between proper and right so often it became a path others could follow. She delivered a speech once in the committee's chamber that began, "A charter is only as good as the women it fails to silence," and ended in a standing room that forgot it was supposed to be reserved. Sometimes, late, when Widow's Peak was mostly asleep, they sat on the porch drinking milk warmed on the stove because some comforts prove you learn from the first night. The wind rattled the turbines into their song. The stars over Colorado-7 didn't care. The people under them did, and that was the point. "Do you regret it?" Edy would ask, teasing her favorite old joke. "Marrying an old woman? Do you regret it?" Harlan would return, flicking the porch light with a thumb, "Our signal, our home. Saving a half-frozen boy." They didn't. The laughter carried down the slope and snagged on the fence posts Samuel had set with his hand on the rock, as if the land remembered who kept their promises. One evening, the school rang its bell 3 extra times. Kids poured out the door counting in unison, "Hands we hold count twice." They surrounded Harlan and Edy on the path and insisted on carrying, "Nothing, really." They just wanted to prove the sentence right. "Legacy," Edy said to the wind, to the dome, to the ledger, to the boy who had knocked and to the woman who had opened. "It isn't or. It's this." "This," Harlan agreed, and kissed her forehead where she had learned to keep her worry. The turbines hummed yes. If what happened on Widow's Peak taught you that humans are the warmest technology in a cold universe, keep this campfire bright, like the story, subscribe to Sci-Fi Nebula, and drop one short comment about the moment that hit you hardest.